Hey, Patty. I know it. Teresa, is it working in there for you? All righty. We're ready. I hope so. We're good. All right, good morning. And welcome on this dreary day. It seems to be a little chilly, a little wet. Just in the form of announcements, prayer pad will be going around here in a second. At the same time, you can email your requests to Betty Hips. I think the email came this morning. At least I think that's when it showed up in my inbox. And then she'll compile both together, the electronic form and the written form, and I think probably send it out this afternoon. So Betty, if you're watching, thank you very much again. And just in the form of meeting, we will not meet next week because that's Thanksgiving week, but then we'll pick it up the Tuesday afterwards, and we'll run for a couple of weeks, and then we'll of course take our break through the holidays, and of course I'll get Kathy to send all this out, but looks like we'll probably maybe stop on the 23rd of December, and then we'll take the 20th, because that's the week of Christmas, the 27th, the 3rd, and we'll start back on the 10th. So, just FYI. But I'll get Kathy to send all that out to you, and we'll go from there. All right, any other announcements before we begin? All good? All right, let's pray. Oh God, again for today, we're grateful for this chance to study together, to fellowship together. And what we pray, God, is that in both of these disciplines, in our time of fellowship and our time of study, we ask for your presence in such a way that it's not just what we learn that's in the text, but so we want that, but we also want an applied style of learning or an understanding of learning to where you leverage our learning in such a way with your Spirit that continually forms the nature of Christ inside of us all. And we also acknowledge, Lord, that looks different for each person, and the speed of that is different for each person. But we want to be open to it. So in a way that you can meet us individually, and then at the same time meet us corporately, that's what we pray for. And we give this prayer in your name. Amen. So before we jump into the text, I do want to kind of give you an idea, at least when it comes to the scope of the Persian Empire. You might remember, not last week, because that was the election week, but the week before, the last time we met, that's the end of chapter, we're in chapter 6, but chapter 5, the end of chapter 5 is also the end of the Babylonian Empire. It started with Nebuchadnezzar's father, It grows to its highest point under Nebuchadnezzar, which I think he reigned for about 43 years, and then it limped along for about another 23 years or so, but eventually the Medes and the Persians pretty much take over the Babylonians, and that's at the very end of chapter 5. That's that chapter where it talks about the handwriting on the wall. Now, I wanted to put this on. You have a handout, so hopefully you have a handout. Some of it's in color. It might not be. It might be in. And if we need to get more, I only printed out 20. Y'all surprised me because I think we have more than 20. So look on with someone maybe next to you, and then I'll get some more at the break. This is not to scale on the board, and but this will at least give you an idea with how large the Persian Empire was at this time. Under Xerxes, which is, you have to go maybe a one ruler or one king or so after Cyrus. The Persian Empire is at its zenith, its apex, and it is at that time the largest empire in the world. So it spanned from, if you can imagine Greece. I know this doesn't look. This is Italy's boot. From the island, Greece, part of Greece, up to just north of the Black Sea, over. So this would be like Russia, China, so well into that area, all the way down to parts of India, and then all parts in between, and just a tiny little portion of North Africa. So I had some images that I was going to show on the screen to give you just sort of a ballpark idea, but my computer's updating, so sorry. But if you're interested, you can Google it up. I mean, it's a huge landmass, and so the Persians, when the Babylonians were maybe in this area, all right. So Persia is a great deal larger than the Babylonians, and Persia will be the big person on the block for a number of years. Eventually, you'll get into the Greeks will take over, and then eventually the Romans, and of course the Romans will go all the way up into Europe, from Europe even over into Britain for a while, and then parts over here, not quite as far north here, but this whole area too was also part of Rome. The Persians are defeated by Alexander the Great. So you probably remember that name. And then eventually he dies young, and I think it's either 5 or 6 of his generals divide up that empire, and then eventually from those in the west, some of those will eventually be the ones that start the Roman Empire, and of course they take over some of the others. So there's your world history in, how many years? I mean, how many centuries? But this will just kind of give you an idea how large the Persians were, because when we jump into chapter 6, we're going to be introduced to a new king, and of course Daniel's still around. Daniel, in chapter 5 he was an old man. He's a little bit older in chapter 6, but if he's maybe teenager, young teen to older teen in chapters 1 and 2, by the time we get to the end of chapter 5 and the beginning of chapter 6, he's about 80. So you get an idea about the scope of his life. He, under the Persians, the parts of the children of Israel are able to return back to Israel. So you have a group that does leave to return, and they begin to rebuild. Daniel is not one of those. He, for whatever reason, chose not to go. Could have been his age, could have been his position in the empire. We don't get insight into why he didn't return, but eventually he will die in Persia, and that's the rest of Daniel. So, any questions about just the scope of how large the Persian Empire is. So chapter 6 is Daniel in the lion's den, which is, might be, maybe David and Goliath might be the most known passage in the Old Testament. But Daniel in the lion's den is up there in the top 3 to 4 or 5. So we'll jump in and we'll look at that, and that'll be our scope for this morning. All right, so if somebody would read for us verses 1, 2, and 3. Not all together. All right, thank you. So one of the things that we always try to do whenever we study the Bible, whether it's Old Testament or New Testament, is we want to look for some connections in some non-canonical, non-biblical writings to sort of draw comparisons. That helps in our greater understanding of the context. And so Darius is the name that is associated. Sometimes when you hear the Persians, you hear the Medes and the Persians. So Darius is part of the Mede name or the Mede lineage. And in some of the Mede documents, M-E-D-E, and there is a name that shows up in their chronicles called Jubaru. And Jubaru is the Mede name that often gets translated Darius. So this is for Jeopardy when you watch it tonight. It's like the Tournament of Champions, right? So, I know we didn't make the cut, but if you just want to show out, because there's debate. Daniel, the historians and biblical theologians will argue, is Darius this guy or is Darius this guy? So Cyrus is a Persian name. And so the school is sort of split, and this might be more than what you want, but just give me 5 minutes. And, again, when you're, do people still play Trivial Pursuit? Is that still a game, right? So, I don't know. I mean, if you play that, then, or Jeopardy or whatever it may be, or just over Thanksgiving dinner, drop Gubaru as a name or whatever, and just see the looks of like, what? But anyway, there's some who would put Darius in the Mede line as he's a separate person, as if to say Cyrus gave this region of what is Babylon, which is where we're at, gave it to Darius as the chief ruler there, as if to say Cyrus is the ruler of the empire. Darius might be, the head of the three who's over all the satraps. And so there's some that would want to link him down that line. There's, and this is, I land in this camp, because dual titles were not, they were common in that day. And often what they would do, like when you have the Medes and the Persians coming together to form one empire, which we will know as the Persians, it's good to put your lineage from both sides. If you could link your lineage down the Mede side of royalty and down the Persian side of royalty, then that increases your status amongst the people. Not unlike if you think to the British, all the issues around British history, how they would want to marry into one house. And then, because then you'd have this house, and the descendants from both of those houses would, that would increase their claim to the throne. And I would argue you got a little bit of this going on, that sometimes Cyrus would refer to himself as Darius whenever he's trying to increase his stance with the Medes. If he wanted to increase his stance or his place with the Persians, then he would refer to the Cyrus side of the house. But just if you might have a study Bible that says, depending on the editors of that Bible, they might say, Darius, they might give you that name, or they might want to put Darius in the Mede camp and say there was someone else, Cyrus. 6 and 1, half a dozen. On one level, I don't think it matters. But, for those that want to split the hair, I guess it could. So I can see that y'all are significantly impressed by that. So with that, we'll move on, right? So don't worry, that won't be part of the test. I can promise you that. So that was just a free nugget. But both of them seem possible. Darius the Mede as Gubaru, either as the governor of that region, or Babylon, or was it King Cyrus himself? Both of them have some traction. The bottom line is Darius, whether he's over all the Persian Empire or over that big region, Darius is a guy that is of some level of status. And the Persian Empire, some documents have the Persian Empire divided into 23 regions or provinces. Some of it have 29. So we have this introduction of 120 satraps, and satraps would be like governors. They would be, governors of a state, for lack of better words. And so what Darius did was not that he, because people would say, well, wait a minute, there was only 23 or 29 provinces. The Bible's incorrect because it says 120. And it's not that Darius divided the empire into 120 provinces, but what you have is, of the 23 or 29 provinces, you have 120 people who, at different times rule over those provinces. And of those 120, there are 3 that sort of rule over the 120. And Daniel is named as one of the 3. So if you can imagine the king, Daniel and the other 2, and then you have these 23 or 29 provinces. Of those 23 or 29, 120 people are watching over them, if that makes sense. Let me stop, make sure we all are following. We're still good? Tracking? Y'all need some donuts, some sugar? So as we chose correctly, Becky. Well, you chose correctly on the donuts. But there are, again, typical to the Babylonians, the Persians have created, they're well known for their structure. They've divided the empire into these different regions. There are people who have oversight over those regions, and there are people who have oversight over them who eventually relate to the king or to the ruler. Satrap just means protector of the kingdom. And and there were inside of each satrap, or inside of each division or province, one province might be broken down into smaller provinces. You have, like, say, the United States, one group, then you have states. Inside of states, you have other areas, and then inside of those other areas, you've got smaller areas. The same thing would existed back in the Persian Empire. It was a huge empire, the largest empire at that time. It's divided into smaller territories, and the satraps are the ones that have oversight over those smaller territories. And the satrap's job, they gave account of what's going on in their region to those 3 administrators, who would then report back to the king or report back to the ruler, mainly around the issues of taxes. So you can see where the organization is coming in. They would make sure that they watched over the levels of taxes. Also would watch over to make sure there were not any revolts or rebellions. But their main job was to make sure that the king got his money. So taxes have always been here for a long time. So, but they're just level divisions. How Darius came to know Daniel, we don't know. So we go from the end of chapter 5. It's Babylonians. We get to chapter 6, it's Persians. All of a sudden, Darius is aware of Daniel because Daniel is promoted to one of those three people with the idea that Daniel might even be the one that's over them. We don't know how they knew each other. I think you can make a case that, how did chapter 5 end? Writing. It's not just the writing on the wall, but who could read the writing on the wall and gave an interpretation? Daniel. And what happened to the person that Daniel gave the interpretation to? What? Yeah, he's dead. That's right. So, and the reason why is because the Persians were just sitting right outside of the city of Babylon waiting to come in, and they came in through, they actually dammed up the water. Remember from 2 weeks ago, they dammed up the Euphrates River. So then they could just sort of walk through a swampy region and make their way into the city. Obviously, I think you can make a case that the Persians would have heard of what Daniel did with that king. So that could have been the first introduction about the handwriting on the wall. They would have had access to the Babylonian library, which had well documented there with that history. They would have known about Nebuchadnezzar. Obviously, Nebuchadnezzar knew Daniel. So there's enough information that if to lead, or at least to draw the conclusion that Darius would have known about Daniel from multiple different ways. And the next thing you know, Daniel is promoted into a level of leadership. Because this is about, maybe 1 to 2 years after the end of chapter 5. We can date Darius. We have a pretty good date for him. And so it would have been 2 years, up to maybe about 18 months after the Babylonians fell. But we end verse 3, or at least the first part of this chapter, with Daniel having some level of leadership. His skills, his character, all of that is, he is known, his reputation of distinguishing himself among the others because of his exceptional qualities. Actually, what it means in verse 3 is that Daniel had an exceptional spirit within him. And that could be his abilities, like his giftedness, or it could be his good attitude. Maybe it's a little bit of both. We don't know. But we do know that Daniel has a position of leadership. So that's the setting, at least in the beginning. We know that there's a new empire, new players. The consistent player is Daniel. And Daniel, again, finds himself not just in any level of leadership, but he's one of the high officials over maybe a large region of satraps. All right, all good? So if somebody then would read verses 4 and 5. So now we have we have something else that's entering into our chapter, our story, and it's not just the other people, but the other people are what? Jealous, envious. So let's talk a little bit about jealousy and envy, even though it's not in the passage, but it's definitely something that none of us deal with, but everybody else does. So we'll just talk about them to some degree. All you are at home, sorry, we're talking about you. If you're here today, then you get a free pass, but those that are home, no. So jealousy or envy, both of the, I've heard some people say jealousy, I think, is, jealousy is where you feel you want to, it's about what you have, and envy is about what you don't have, or vice versa. To me, they're pretty much synonyms more than anything else. In the Latin, invidia, that's to look maliciously upon. That's the literal translation of the Latin word for jealousy. In the New Testament, the literal translation is a person who has an evil eye, and which is nice, isn't it? And because the idea is that what is yours should be mine. There's really the processing that takes place when it comes to jealousy or when it comes to envy. And the reason why it's considered one of the seven deadly sins. Now, a little bit of the history of the seven deadly sins. There's nothing that's, for lack of better words, magical about them. The reason why they're called one of the seven deadly, why they're called the seven deadly sins is because of the, one, it's a struggle for pretty much everybody, so it's universal. But then two, the destruction or the behavior that it comes out of those seven deadly sins have a larger ramification or consequences than just something else. And other sins can be, probably can have their origin back at one of the seven deadlies. And of the seven deadlies, the one that's probably the kingpin of it all is pride. So pride sort of like leads into whether it be greed, whether it be lust, whether it be envy or jealousy, sloth, all those others. But what makes envy so destructive is because there's never enough. And so it has no end that eventually lands where someone has gratification. Because it thrives on this comparison or this comparative evaluation of things. And so if you talk about in terms of appetite, the appetite never ends. It never ceases. Because what happens is you might look and say, so if this is true, what is yours should be mine. I look out there and I say, okay, this should be mine, and say I work to obtain it. The next thing I do is look, and because that I is what it is, it looks and sees something else. And so it'll just move on to the next object or to the next person or whatever it may be. And so it has no end. It's like a bottomless pit. And now this is something, this is my thoughts. Y'all can tell me I'm wrong. Not that a lot of people come and confess to me, okay? But don't get a lot of confessions on this. Or admittance, or, and there are sometimes I might hear somebody say, yeah, it's just my pride got in the way. I might have to go, not that I keep a record, but I might have to go back and think, when has someone ever said, yeah, I'm just jealous? Or I'm just envious? It's one of those things that sort of we keep in the corner, and we hope that nobody, we don't want to admit it. Sometimes we don't even want to admit it to ourselves, much less to another person. After all, how comfortable are you, even us talking about jealousy? Or to say, yeah, I got an example from my own life, Shane. I'll be happy to raise my hand and tell you. Right? Yeah, so no, we seldom want to confess this. The behavior of one who is envious or jealous is fairly calculating. And we're going to see that in the passage. Because there are people who are jealous of Daniel, and they are incredibly calculating. And so it has a tendency to work in the shadows. And now I think this is, I'm going to give you my pitch for how to deal with jealousy, because this is something that will plague everybody. So nobody gets a free pass. All right. So let's just be open and upfront and honest. And if it's not, there will be an apple that you see that looks so good, and you'll want it to be yours. All right? It might not be today, but just give it time. I promise you there's going to be something else. So the remedy to this is anchored in love and mercy, because love and mercy are not calculating. They're the opposite of that. If anything, love, and instead of being calculating, it leads to generosity. The root word for generosity is where we get the word large. And so when it talks about God being generous, God is very large compared to something being very small in their thinking and how they behave or how they go about life. Now, the way I think love and mercy are the remedy to jealous and envy is because it's out of love and mercy that where people find contentment. Now, if you weren't here on Sunday, the best way for me to kind of talk a little bit about contentment is if you go back and listen to the sermon. In Philippians, there's a passage, I think it's chapter 4, and where it talks about Paul is writing to the church at Philippi and pretty much says, what you've seen and heard and witnessed in me, put those things into practice. And then the very next part that Paul described is, I've learned the secret to be content in all circumstances. So it's not something external for Paul that led to his contentment. When jealousy thinks that something external, once you have that or possess that, you're going to be fulfilled. Now it's a lie. I mean, it's not. It doesn't work, but at least that's the thought behind it. And yet, Paul would go on to talk about the reason or why he is content in all circumstances, is because he places his contentment from the inside out, not from the outside in. And that inside-out work is the result of the Holy Spirit's work in you. And that's process-oriented, which means it takes time. It's like maturing. You walk a step, you learn how to do that. You walk, then you run a step. I mean, just little by little by little by little. The work of the Holy Spirit is to bring about a new nature on the inside. Now, in Colossians 3:10. And if you're at home, I didn't give any of these passages to Teresa, so they're not going to come up on your screen. But in Colossians 3:10, Paul gave commentary about this process of contentment through the work of God by using the analogy of taking off clothes and putting on clothes. But instead of being clothes, he talks about image. He says, take off this image that is anchored in things like this, put on the image of being renewed by the nature of Christ. Now, this is a God and me working together adventure or process. So it's my work in this is I have to avail myself to the work of the Holy Spirit. And so disciplines are the best way to do that, spiritual disciplines. So the reason why you study, why you worship, why you pray, why you serve, those are all catalysts that God can leverage to bring about a new nature. And it takes time, all right? Some things are kind of screwed in pretty tight. And so to unscrew it and put something else in takes time. And for some people, depending on their life, their previous history, things of that nature, sometimes that journey's long. And for others, maybe not quite as long. The good news is that the work of the Holy Spirit won't stop, regardless of how long that journey is. So there's hope there. So contentment, what people, as they go down this road with God, and their nature's being formed, reformed over, and little by little, bit by bit, what they live into is that they don't need these outside things anymore to be what makes them content. They're content first in and of themselves, and to use Paul's language, because the love and mercy of God never fails. But jealousy is an issue. And it's an issue that exists inside of people. It doesn't matter if they're in the church or not in the church. But the great thing about the work of God is that God is not content to leave us where we meet. But it is an issue. And so maybe the first step would be is to just acknowledge that, the truth is, I am jealous, or I am envious. Have you ever seen that movie? Gosh, it's been a long time ago. This is where I just kind of go off on a tangent. Jack Nicholson is the character. His name is Melvin Udall, and Helen Hunt's in it. And Jack Nicholson's character is a writer, and he's kind of recluse, and he had a real rough upbringing with his dad, and so he's sort of mean and sort of just not a nice guy. And but he falls in love with Helen Hunt, who's a waitress. Did y'all know that movie? What is that as good as it gets? Is that it? Yeah. So there's a part in there that just reminds me of this whole Envious, where he's having this conversation, and I can't remember. I don't know if he's talking to the Greg Kinnear character or not, but I'm going to paraphrase. Basically, what Jack Nicholson's character says is that, it's not just that other people had it better. It's that we're angry that they had it better, and because we're the ones that are like, we haven't received anything, Well, that's envy. And that's jealousy. So go home and watch As Good as It Gets. It's funny, all right? So, I think it won an Academy Award, but anyway. So John and I eat breakfast every Monday, sort of to go over the week and just talk about things that are going on inside the church and make sure that we're all on the same page. And we're talking about what we're reading and how, what are the disciplines that go from Bible study into connections in the world that can help, explain things when it comes to teaching or preaching. And I told him, I said, for me, it's movies. I don't know, every movie I watch, I try to see it through a theological lens, and I think As Good as It Gets is about as up there as any of them. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, you caught that. Yeah, pardon the multiple puns, all right? But jealousy is an issue. It's not just something in our day. It was a part of Daniel's day, and so let's move in and look at where jealousy and envy, this idea of what's yours should be mine, or this idea of to look maliciously upon, or to have an evil eye. Let's look at how that plays out in the life of some of Daniel's contemporaries. So if somebody would read verses 6 through 9. All right, so there we go. Because of the king planned to set Daniel over all the satraps and administrators, there were some that were jealous, envious, and so they began to examine Daniel's activities, his work record, to discover something that would maybe be a flaw in his work. They could not find it, so then even in his character, couldn't find anything there. So the way they're going to go about it is through Daniel's religion, through his faith. The jealous officials, and so it's not all of them, all satraps. It would have been those that were just around that area, a smaller group compared to all of them. It's not like all of them were. Go ahead. Yeah, so they are. Yeah, so all right, so you're drawing some of the conclusions behind some of this. So his character was flawless, which meant that if you examined his records, he's not heavy-handed when it comes to the taxes. Maybe skimming, or in the ancient world, often when it would come to taxes, the king would, or at least the ruling power would assess a number for the region. And then the tax collectors, or those that would be in charge of the taxes, they could pretty much collect whatever they wanted over that number. Or they could just collect the number. When we get into the New Testament, I mean, the Romans weren't the only ones that had that type of formula. The reason why the tax collectors in the Gospels are hated is because what the Romans would do is, and similar here, right? Because Daniel's not Persian, right? So, but they'd find somebody that's skilled, good, that at least could get the number. Like, for instance, let's say if Columbus was one of the regions in Persia, they would say, okay, Columbus, your taxes are $10. So that the satrap would have to make sure that the Columbus region gave $10 to the king. If they wanted to charge $15, didn't matter because the king got paid. As long as he kept the peace, they weren't. So what tax collectors would do is they would try to find that number that's definitely could to give to the empire or give to the emperor or the king, but enough for whatever they wanted, but just not enough that would lead to rebellion. So the reason why they're hated, at least by Roman times, is because they were notorious for cooking the books. Instead of $10, guess what, Columbus, you got $20. And they could impress the soldiers into enforcement. So it's not like you could say, well, I don't want to pay it. They said, that's fine, we'll just bring in the army and we'll take all your property. The reason why they're hated, at least by Roman times, is because Rome really didn't care once the region had their number. And the governor, like Pilate, right, in the New Testament, he had two major jobs a part of his, two parts of his job description. One of them was that he kept the peace, and then two, that he got the money. Outside of that, he can pretty much do what he wants. And so it's this Persia's not too far off from the Romans. So, but what we have in Daniel is a character that probably did not do that, or if he did do it, it was enough. I'm not sure how he got paid. So but it wasn't to the same level as everybody else. Most likely, he was just a fair man, or a fair employee, and he didn't cook anything. They would. Well, the king would, yeah, because the king got his money, and let me say it to you this way: are you more inclined to pay more taxes or less taxes?
But I'm saying the king was going to put him over all of them.
Yeah, that's right.
So he would have known what they were doing.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, all right. So I misunderstood what you were saying. Yeah, you're 100% right. And they wouldn't have liked that because Daniel would have said, we're not running a skim here. You if it's $10, collect $10. You live within the confines of what's being given to you by the king. So, this is a guy who follows the law to the law, and with not a lot of gray. And so you can see the struggle. And he would have been tight, that's a good, nice Greek word or Hebrew word, very tight with the king. So inside the king's court, Daniel would have been, hey, let me go and call Daniel about any financial matters. He would have been the treasurer. And then you've got all these other people who are under him. So you can see the level of jealousy. One, that's a coveted position, and it's a powerful position. And he's got he's the hand of the king, for lack of better words. He's the, yeah. So and so they're envious for various reasons, and so they obviously, if you're a subordinate, how do you get your supervisor out of office? Well, you got to find a fault and expose the fault to the king, and then let the king make the decision. And they can't find one. They can't find one with his character. They can't find one with his work product. So the third level down is, let's see if we can come up with something that Daniel hangs himself. And so you've heard of the law of the Medes and the Persians. So whenever a king would speak a law and they put it down in writing as it to be official decree, even the king was bound by that. That's what the law, I mean, the reason why, I guess that's like kind of like a euphemism for it's ironclad. So when the king, in this case would have been Darius, when Darius makes the law that you cannot pray for 30 days unless unto me, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. And then, once that becomes spoken and then written, then it's official. And so even the king is bound by that. Because once the law is written and it becomes official, and then Daniel is exposed by praying, and Daniel's asked, and I mean, what we're going to read after the break is that, yeah, I did it. The king has to follow through. And so it's the king that actually sends Daniel to the lion's den. But there's remorse. I mean, it actually will say something along the lines of, he tried throughout, or paraphrase, the king he had to the end of the day to get it done. All right? So from the time that Daniel is exposed to the end of the day, the king is working to try to find a loophole. When he can't, he has to make good on the law. And so Daniel spends the night in the lion's den. All right, so that's sort of we fast forward. Thanks, Pam. Appreciate that. No, I'm just kidding. But let's take a break. We'll take a break for about 10 minutes and we'll come back.
that
Satrap, Satraps.
Oh, satrap.
Yeah, satrap. It's like another word for governor.
Yeah.
Or you might have like administrator, a governor, an official.
Oh, yeah,
That's all
I've
the
got
same.
all those.
Yeah, yeah.
Don't have
Yeah, satraps. Yeah. Yeah, Satraps.
Like a sand trap.
That's right. Yeah, exactly right.
Does sat mean something?
It actually means that one who governs, So let me see what's the origin of it. Okay. Well, if I can find it real quickly. Two-minute warning. So, Joanne, Jojo, you might have the word, do you have like presidents or administrators? Yeah. Yeah, or commissioners. They're all within the same line. Satraps, I'm trying to think if it has the origin of the word. Let's see.
In case I'm called upon to say that.
Yeah, exactly.
All the origin.
I hear you, yeah. So, all right, let's come back together. Just a couple of notes about the, verses 4 and 5, and then 6 through 9. Two facts concerning Daniel's religious character. One, he didn't hide his convictions. They're very public. And so when he prays out in the open. He would have prayed 3 times a day, and so obviously they were aware of that. If not, they wouldn't have known to go to the king and try to come up with some level of a trap to catch him. And then the other one is that Daniel's commitment is he won't compromise it. Even in the face of punishment, or maybe even the face of death. So you get some insight into Daniel's character, which is pretty solid. As for the group that went to the king, would not have been all of the satraps or the administrators, because they would have been all throughout the empire. So this was probably, it would stand to reason that we're talking about just those few that are connected into the main area where Daniel's located, and so you have this verbiage that says for 30 days, don't pray to a god or pray to a person. I mean, the praying to the God's fairly clear, and probably what most people conclude, and I would agree with this, it's not just praying in general, is that you could not pray to your God, you would have to pray to the Persian, similar to what Nebuchadnezzar, remember when Nebuchadnezzar, when he built the large tower, so you could pray, you just would have to pray, you have for 30 days, if you were going to pray, you'd have to pray towards Persian gods, not to any god. And for Daniel, that's a big no-no. And then this idea of praying to, some versions say to a man, or praying to a person. And the idea is that the literal language there is to make a request of a request. So no one can make a request to someone else. And the idea is that you couldn't go to a priest or couldn't go to someone else, that if you were not going to pray to Persian deity or deities, then you would have to go to the king in order to pray. And so, you can see that when Daniel goes home, goes upstairs. In Vienna, you had to learn to preach while swallowing gnats. And so in the middle of the sermon, you could find somebody going, just because it's all in your face, and it's just horrible. And so there'd be a couple of times where you just kind of, you just had to go with it, So, anyways, so the idea was that you couldn't pray to anything other than Persian or to make a request through the king as being the mediator. And so when Daniel went home, goes upstairs, and upstairs it's not like a two-story house as much as that you had a one-story home. You could go up on the roof, and a lot of times they would go up on the roof, and there would be either like a covered area or something like that. And so the idea of seeing him through a window, I mean, he's out in the public. It's not private for Daniel. And of course, they catch him praying, and eventually will bring it back to the king. And, it's a gruesome fate that would await anybody who breaks the law. The parties would be thrown into the lion's den, where they would have been torn to pieces. What's interesting, once Darius signed the decree, according to their own rules, it could not be altered. It could not be repealed. I mean, it was the law of the land, even for the king. And so that's the environment that we have for Daniel. So where did we leave off? What verse was it? 9. So let's go from 10 to 13, if somebody would jump in there.
Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about the royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days anyone who prays to any god or man except you, O king, will be thrown into the lion's den?
Yeah, so here we have I would argue a smaller group, not all of them, but definitely a group that goes to the king and have the debate was out there. Daniel did not. I mean, Daniel continued on in his normal practice, and now they're there to make accusation of and condemnation ultimately for Daniel. The text says Daniel's custom was to pray and to give thanks. That the word there is actually to praise, and he would do it 3 times a day, facing Jerusalem. So I mean, you see his level of courage, his level of conviction, even in the face of knowing what could happen. So it's not like Daniel is oblivious to what's going on. He's very much aware. So I mean, what do you think's going on in Daniel's mind during this time? Yeah. So I mean, devoted. Keep in mind, he's also at an age. It's like, yeah, you know what? I've been doing this for 80 years. I'm not stopping. Yeah. So there's something to it. Which brings up an interesting point. And yesterday, but not yesterday. Well, yesterday in our staff meeting, I talked about the idea of preparation and how that leads to performance. And some of this came from Buddy's sermon Sunday in the 8:30 service. I wish he'd recorded it. I thought it was really good. And preparation, you can't buy, borrow, or steal. And it does lead to, it does affect performance or affects, it will influence a person's effectiveness. And, so I'm thinking about Daniel in light of Buddy's sermon. And, this is something the text is fairly clear. Daniel's been doing this every day as long as as Daniel is alive. I mean, at least where he has an age where he can, some level of prayer is his practice. If that is your preparation, day in and day out, objects in motion have a tendency to stay in motion. That's actually not just a law of physics. It's a law of spiritual dynamics. I'm gonna have to coin this and come up with something. So But I mean, if that's your practice every single day, where it's a second nature to you, it's hard not to do that. Even in the face of someone saying, don't. And so there is something to this idea of daily preparation for whatever it will be in the future. And so, I mean, I think there's something to Daniel did this day in and day out, 3 times a day, as a part of his daily life. Well, I mean, it's just hard to stop it. And so that, I think that's an interesting side note in the passage. If we want this level of character, if we want this level of conviction, this level of courage, then, everybody likes the game. That's the easy part, or we think the easy part. That's what the crowd's yelling and screaming and all. I mean, it's like being on stage, I guess. But nobody preparation. That's not fun. Nobody likes that part of life. But I would argue that in order to be successful, to use the sports analogy, in the game, then, the 2-a-day practices really are that important. And so there is something to this spiritually, that if we want a certain level of effectiveness in our life, particularly when it comes to our faith, whether it be contentment, faithfulness, going back to what we talked about earlier, then it's not just in that moment of where we think that's in play. It's every moment before that where you're cultivating that type of heart, that type of mind, that type of identity, so that when it is tested, I mean, the metal's strong. Daniel, this is a perfect example of this. I mean, Daniel would have every reason in the world to not do this. And yet it's part of his daily practice. So Polycarp was a 2nd century saint. And many believe, and I would agree with this, that Polycarp learned the faith from John of Patmos before he was exiled. And so Polycarp becomes the bishop of Smyrna, and it's like maybe 111 AD, somewhere in the neighborhood. Well, there's a time of persecution that takes place under a different emperor. Polycarp's a well-known bishop in the city, so somebody outs him. The church wants to hide him. And Polycarp, by this time, I think he's 86 years old, and he just said, "I'm not going to go in hiding. I'm not going to run. If I get arrested, and then eventually, if I'm martyred, then that's it. But I'm not going to run." And so he's arrested by the local authorities, which means he'd been under house arrest. Which a handful of guards would have been in this house, and they're waiting on authorities from Rome to come to take him to Rome to be martyred. And he ends up cooking dinner for his guards that have arrested him. And eventually the Roman soldiers, they find their way to Smyrna. They send him on to Rome to be martyred, and he's given a chance to recant. And this is in the record, so it's not just a legend. You can look it up. So you know what he says? This is his answer. They ask him to recant his faith in Christ. He goes, "For 86 years, he has been so good to me. Why in this moment of need would I not be good to him?" So, there is something to the preparation. And so for Daniel, this in his, for 80 years, this has been a part of his life. And so when given the opportunity to do something other, he's not going to do it. He was martyred. Yes, oh yeah. Sent him into the lion's den. He was one of those that the lions ate. So he didn't get the same outcome that Daniel got. So I'm being sarcastic, but yeah, he was martyred, and Polycarp's an interesting character. If you just want to ever do some reading, that'll put you to sleep. Go right ahead. But when it's required reading for ante-Nicene church leaders, you have to pick one that'll keep you up at night. Well, Polycarp at least would keep me up a little bit compared to some of the others. Some of them are just duds. I mean, they're faithful people, but boy, reading about their life is just like, oh my word. But Polycarp, I mean, I liked him. So, I mean, I wrote a paper on him. So anyways, praised 3 times. Facing Jerusalem was something that shows up in the Old Testament. Solomon, one of the injunctions that Solomon gave to the people in 1 Kings was after the temple was built to pray facing the temple. And obviously that would have still was around, even though the temple was destroyed in Daniel's day, this idea. And so Daniel pretty much acts in what we would call civil disobedience, and is not going to. He's going to continue to pray and continue on with his daily preparation. So the people do witness that. Obviously, the way the text reads is that they were waiting in the wings to watch and see if he would do it. He did do it. They go to the king. Notice how they remind the king of what the king did. That's I don't know. Did your children ever do that? Dad, you said, if you said you can do this, or you said you would do this, it's like, well, you got to do it. You said it, and notice how they frame Daniel, verse 13. Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, what do we have about Daniel? One of the exiles from Judah. It's not the first time they've reminded the ruler that Daniel's not one of them. Remember, they did the same thing in the previous chapters when it was the Babylonians. So they remind the king that he's the one that you put in charge, who's not one of us, has now violated your rules, and he does it 3 times a day, which is interesting to me. How they fashion the argument, almost like little children. At least my children were keen on picking up on, but Dad, you said, and you. What's that? Yeah, well, maybe, So the good news is I don't see them quite as much as I used to. So I don't, maybe they don't hear me saying all the things anymore. But we'll, now they just sort of make up things. Like Caroline the other day just said, Dad, I've decided that I want to stay on an extra term to get another part of a degree. And I was like, well, who's going to pay for this? And she was like, well, you are. So I was like, hang on, we didn't talk about this, So I've discovered that I need to stay on for another thing, We've decided that, and that would be one of her. She was one time when her sophomore year she had 5 of them living in one apartment, 5-bedroom, sort of like giant apartment. And she called one day and said, well, we've decided that we want to move out to something smaller where it's just us 2. And I was like, who is we, babe? And she said, well, that's Emma Ray and me. And I was like, all right, thanks for letting me know. So, but you said, right? So, all right, well, let's keep going. I need to finish this thing before it's time to leave. So how are we doing? Any comments or questions about so far in the text about Daniel or the king or what's maybe going on? All right, so let's someone read verses 14 through 16. Yeah, so again, we see, this. So what do you think the king is distressed about? The fact that Daniel violated the law or that the king was trapped? Yeah, so I mean, obviously you can from the passage, the last verse, verse 16, you do see the level of concern that he has for Daniel. So there was some affection for Daniel in some form or fashion, but the stress that maybe his top, his right hand man is now going to be thrown to the lion's den, and from the text, I mean, Darius. The assumption is Daniel's going to die. The end, even if like, hey, may your God protect you, but it's like, you got to go into the lion's den. And, but there's a level of, again, the law of the Medes and the Persians. Once it was spoken, written down, and signed, even the king was accountable to it. And so, maybe this is the first light where the king realized, that they kind of threw one by him. So there's a level of frustration there, and a level of some distress around what's going to happen to Daniel. They emphasize that Daniel's really not one of them. He was an exile captured from Judah. This was from the previous passage. And that his actions, the way they framed it to the king, was that Daniel's actions was disrespectful not only to the king's law, but to the king himself. They declared Daniel pays no attention to you, O king. And the fact that he did it multiple times a day when it comes to praying, it's not just a momentary lapse on Daniel's part. This was something that Daniel knew and was, did it repeatedly. Obviously, the king is distressed. It grieved him is the literal word or the literal translation. Not so much about Daniel praying, but that this is the first time that he realized the real purpose behind the law, and so the king is exposed. It was not to his honor, the king's honor, as much as it was to eliminate a rival from jealous officials, which is interesting. Remember we were talking about calculating as one of the behaviors or side effects of jealousy and envy. Well, there you go. You see it. So Daniel, let's keep going. So if someone would read verses 17 and 18, we'll see how this all plays out. So we do get insight into the king, at least what's going on with Darius. There would have been attempts by the king, or at least some officials of the king, to find a loophole. When no loophole was found, the king did have to throw Daniel into the lion's den. He did. The way that would, obviously a stone, and then what they would do is they would fashion it with something like chains, and then it would have some level of like mud, dried mud that would hold the chains, and inside the mud he would put the king's signet, so that anybody that saw it would realize that if they were to try to free Daniel, then they're doing that against the king. So it's an official deal. Daniel's thrown into the lion's den, and there is some level on behalf of the king that he hopes that it doesn't end the way that he most likely thinks that it will. So Daniel's in the lion's den. And so we're getting close to the end. So let's finish up. If somebody would read 19 through 24. All right. There you go. Thank you.
overjoyed and gave order to let Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones.
Yeah, so it doesn't end well for at least not just the other officials, but also their families. So Daniel, so the king, the way the law or the way the punishment played out in Persia would be that if he's thrown in at the end of the day, if by the next morning he's not dead, then the law has been fulfilled, so he could be freed. And so you see the reason why at first light the king runs down there. It's because he wants to see if that's possible. It's like, all right, the moment it's been fulfilled, okay, that part's over. Daniel can come out. And of course, Daniel's there. You see where Daniel's, everything about Daniel is vindicated. And you do have Darius with some allusion to Yahweh as the living God, which we don't know how far that would go with Darius, as if to be, did he believe in Yahweh? We have no idea. He does acknowledge that Yahweh was responsible for Daniel's safety. Daniel, on his own word, gives some level of a commentary about what happened, that there was an angel or a messenger that was sent in that night, and because of that, the lions did not attack. We have no idea who the angel is, right? So I mean, some people would say it's an angel. Some people would say it's Jesus. I mean, flip a coin. I mean, I don't mean that just sarcastically. I mean, but we don't know. I mean, that's somebody trying to speculate on something we don't have an answer to. But we do know, messenger from God sent. Messenger was responsible for the lion's mouth remaining shut, no harm coming to Daniel. He is examined. There's no harm at all. And because of that, Darius is overjoyed. The actual literal wording there in verse 23 is that it pleased him greatly. And then the result is that all the other people, they're thrown into the lion's den with their families, and they didn't get a messenger, and doesn't work out well for them, and so they are destroyed. And then the last part of the book of this chapter is again, it's almost like a doxology. And we've had these previously. There's been a few in the book of Daniel. So when you pick up in verse 25, then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, the nations, the language that dwell in all the earth. Basically, this is like a king's statement. It's like a formal document. Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. And then we get a description like a doxology of this God. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to no end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Now, this part of chapter 6, when this ends, this concludes the part of Daniel that is tied more to the historical aspect of Daniel. When we pick up in coming weeks, beginning in chapter 7, begins visions that Daniel has. And so buckle up, one. And then, but so it's going to be the apocalyptic style of writing. So you're going to get something that looks very similar to, say, the book of Revelation, things of that. You're going to have different terminology around that. And so there'll be debate about, is this one vision that Daniel writes about in a number of different ways, or is it multiple visions? We're going to pick all that up in the weeks to come. But I just want to kind of give you a little bit of heads up about where we go. Now, we're not going to meet next week because of Thanksgiving, but in the weeks to come, this is where we're going to be. So what do you think about chapter 6? Anything that stands out that is very noteworthy to you, or something that is encouraging or kind of interesting, or a kind of an aha type deal?
The three men were with Daniel in the lion's den, right?
No. Yeah, there's just the three in the pit, not counting Daniel's not in the pit. So, two different stories. The three go into the fiery pit. Daniel's not there. Daniel goes in the lion's den. The three are not there. Yeah, because remember they look down into the pit and they see 4 instead of 3. So and the fourth shines like the Son of God is what it says, or something similar. And so definitely have some intervention. Which brings up an interesting thing, and I have like 1 minute. The whole concept of miracles. The best book on miracles, and I know you are going to really like this, is the book from C.S. Lewis. All right, so and if you don't want to read it, which I can tell you probably don't, the summation of it all is from C.S. Lewis: miracles do happen. They are the suspension of the norm, but they're not lasting. All right? So, Lazarus is raised from the dead, but Lazarus died. Yeah, exactly right. So eventually it'll be subject to natural order, natural law, things that the way the...
What's the name of the C.S. Lewis?
Miracles.
Oh, it is.
Mm-hmm. But what he says is that the purpose of miracles is, and the fact that they're supernatural, is to, similar to this, to highlight the work of God that transcends even the natural order, which is why it's a suspension of what the normal way of things are, but it's temporary. And I think that's a good breakdown of things. Well, it's or they have a start point and an end point. Daniel in the lion's den, he wasn't perpetually saved from lions forever, So that's what I mean by they have it's not permanent. So, all good? All right. Go in peace. Happy Thanksgiving.